All right, my name's Elia, and as Francesca mentioned, I'm going to be speaking to you about some preparedness work we've been doing for a pest called exotic leaf miner flies, and how this has been playing a role in the recent real-life incursion of one of these species. As a little background, if you're not familiar with exotic leaf miner flies, there's a set of 3 species, all in the genus Liriomyza. The American Serpentine leaf miner, vegetable leaf miner, and the Serpentine leaf miner, which are all notorious pests overseas. They're known to cause a lot of economic damage, be tricky to control, and have extremely wide host preference ranges. And vegetable leaf miner, this one in the middle, we've actually had present in Australia in the very northern tip of Queensland since 2015 under very careful quarantine control. And the others have been high on our radar as they were present as close as Indonesia. But you may have heard in the last month that there has now been a confirmed incursion of Serpentine leaf miner into the Sydney region. It's been found as far away as Queensland as well, as of November. And very recently, the Consultative Committee on Emergency Plant Pests that formed in response to the incursion, which has been meeting throughout this process, has decided that it's not a pest that's going to be technically feasible to eradicate, which means we'll be moving more towards a transition to management. If you want to find out more information on this actual incursion, OzVeg has been putting out updates that can get you caught up on where things are at, and you can just visit the OzVeg website page and search for their latest news articles. You can also visit New South Wales and Queensland Department of Primary Industries websites. But for today, I just want to tell you a bit more about these pests in general and about some research we've been doing, which is going to actually play a really important role now that Serpentine leaf miner has entered the country. Now, Serpentine leaf miner, as well as all these other Liriomyza species, their life cycle has 4 stages. They start as an egg, go to larvae, pupae, and adult stages. And the way this life cycle plays out is that females lay eggs inside of a leaf. That egg hatches, and you get a little yellow maggot, which actually lives between the top and bottom surface of the leaf. You can just see them through the top of the leaf. And they start to chew away, creating tunnels in the leaf. And this is how actually they get their name leaf miner. You can see in this animation a little black mouth part that looks a bit like a pickaxe. And they actually create mines right through the center of the leaf before eventually cutting their way out, crawling away, dropping to the ground, and pupating in the soil. And it's that larval stage right here that causes the most damage. And this is why these are considered quite notorious overseas pests, is they actually create all of these white trailing mines through the leaf. And you can also see these little white spots here, which is caused by the females poking holes in the leaf to lay eggs and to feed. But together, what this damage does is it really reduces the photosynthetic ability of the plant, because it's literally removing photosynthetic material. The little stippling holes also open up the plant to secondary infections. And if you get a lot of this damage, not only can fruits be stunted, plants be stunted and fail to fruit. It can even kill a plant, particularly if the plants are very young. And what also makes these pests such notorious pests overseas is that they don't just like 1 or 2 different host plants. They have an incredibly wide range of host preferences that pretty much cover all of the vegetables we humans like to eat as well. For Serpentine leaf miner, it spans at least 15 families. Particularly fond of potatoes, other plants in the Solanaceae like tomatoes and eggplants. They get into melons, they get into beans, they get into brassicas, they get into onions, and they get into ornamentals. It's also important to note that Serpentine leaf miner will get into quite a lot of weed hosts in Australia and native plants. For instance, we already know they like sow thistle, which you might see all over the place in urban areas. If you're around Victoria, New South Wales, I know it's very common. It just means we will need to really hit the ground running, determining what sort of weed hosts that this Serpentine leaf miner is gonna prefer to be in Australia. Now, these pests have been recorded to cause some really significant losses overseas. For instance, the Serpentine leaf miner was reported to cause up to 70% yield losses in potatoes in Indonesia when it first arrived in the 90s. And there's a lot of other examples of these really high losses in the early stages of incursions. And a really important question is, why is this happening? Because if Australia can answer that question, we can try our very best to avoid it. And to answer that question, I want to show you first these two pictures. This is damage caused by vegetable leaf miner rather than serpentine leaf miner, but very closely related. You can see two bean plants. One of these plants has been regularly treated with insecticide sprays, and the other one has not. And it's not quite as simple of a picture as it might seem, because it's this really festy looking bean on the right that's had regular treatment with spray insecticides. So what's happening here? These Liriomyza leaf miner, including serpentine leaf miner, in their natural state are controlled really effectively by tiny little parasitoid wasps. Those are their natural enemies. These wasps essentially lay eggs on or inside of the fly larvae. And when those eggs hatch, they eat the larvae alive, a bit like the movie Alien. So they're pretty neat life cycles. However, these wasps are really sensitive to chemicals, and what happens when insecticide sprays are inappropriately applied, it really wipes out the beneficial populations. And while it might reduce the fly population initially, the flies tend to be a lot more tolerant to chemicals than the wasps are, because they might be protected inside the leaf as larvae, or they might actually be resistant. And these Liriomyza have quite a lot of resistances reported overseas. And so once you remove the wasps, the flies are now released from natural control. They grow to really large numbers, and they can cause really high levels of damage. And for this reason, they are a really classic example of a secondary pest, one that's only a pest once the situation is changed and they're no longer naturally controlled. And this is the scenario that's been ubiquitously associated with high losses overseas. And this really is the most important thing for Australia right now, because this is what we want to avoid. Now, we are actually extremely lucky in this incursion, because not only is Australia essentially one of the very last countries to have incursions of these exotic pests, these polyphagous Liriomyza, which means that we get to learn from all of the mistakes and all of the successes that have happened overseas. We're also not hitting the ground, from scratch and sort of proceeding in the dark here, because Hort Innovation actually funded a really substantial and comprehensive preparedness project back in 2017. So we've actually been working on exotic leaf miner, developing preparedness plans for the last 3.5 years. And this means that, serpentine leaf miner arriving, while it's certainly bad news for growers all over Australia, it's not as bad as it could have been if not for this upfront investment. Our project's been really collaborative. It's been led by Cesar Australia, but we've also had partners at the University of Melbourne, Plant Health Australia, the North Australian Quarantine Strategy, AusVeg, and we've had a lot of input from experts overseas as well, which has been really valuable. And just to give you a little timeline and sort of snapshot of what this project has entailed, we started our project back in 2017. We focused primarily on vegetable leaf miner, because this is the species that was already up in the Torres Strait and the very north tip of Queensland. We've been developing surveillance plans, researching biocontrol options, creating risk forecasts, preparing chemical options, and doing as much awareness raising as we can. And about halfway through the project, we actually expanded the project to include the other two exotic Liriomyza, the American serpentine leaf miner and the serpentine leaf miner. And we were actually only about a month away from handing in our final report when serpentine leaf miner arrived. So we were sitting in a pretty good position to start sharing resources immediately. And when we have an exotic pest incursion, one of the first things that happens is a consultative committee on emergency plant pest meets and reviews the situation. And they're really looking for any resources that they can to help make more informed decisions. And thanks to this project, we were able to provide them with a whole slew of resources within 2 days of being notified of the incursion. And that included a full contingency plan for serpentine leaf miner, complete hosts lists based off of everything we know they eat overseas, as well as several scientific manuscripts that covered new diagnostic options, scientifically tested survey guidelines, and even forecasts predicting establishment and spread based off of the specific conditions of this incursion. And in addition to supporting the immediate incursion response, our project has also been preparing quite a lot of resources that are going to also support ongoing management for serpentine leaf miner, now that it has essentially established in several regions within Australia. And this has included work we've done preparing chemical permits to ensure that we had chemical options ready right from the get-go. There's been at least 6 permits that were secured before the incursion even happened, and there's been a few more trickling in since then. We've spent quite a lot of time reviewing biocontrol options, and this is what I'll speak more about in my last few minutes. And we've been doing a lot of work in predicting risk across different regions and in different seasons, so that growers can look at how the seasonality of the pest might overlap with the seasonality of their crops. But I'd like to talk to you about specifically some of the biocontrol work we've been doing. And this has involved leveraging as much overseas learnings as we can, which means a whole lot of literature reviewing, looking at successful integrated pest management programs that have been run overseas in the United States, in Europe and beyond. And then also trying to fill in the gaps for Australia with surveys for what sort of biocontrol options we already have here. And I'll give you a short little rundown, but I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that if you want to learn more about this, there's actually a management guide for exotic leaf miner available on the AusVeg website, which covers both chemical and biocontrol options. But what we learned at the end of the day is Australia has an abundance of those little parasitoid wasps I mentioned earlier, which are attacking native leaf mining species we already have here, as well as some species of Liriomyza we already have here, and that population of vegetable leaf miner that's currently present in the Torres Strait. And in fact, we have at least 50 species of wasps that could be really important for controlling exotic leaf miner if they spread into Australia, and thus will be very important for controlling serpentine leaf miner. And so you can just see here, they're spread all across Australia. We've got species everywhere. And we found this includes the 3 most important species overseas. This beautiful species here with the nice antlers, Hemitarsinus, is relied on heavily overseas for control of all 3 of these exotic Liriomyza. This guy here, Diglyphus, is actually used in mass rearing programs. And we've even got some of our own more Australian specific species already controlling vegetable leaf miner up in the Torres Strait. And really what I just want to end on is to make quite a long story short. We found that Australia has everything it needs for effective biocontrol of these pests, which means it's now just down to us to make sure we use them correctly and we implement appropriate IPM strategies. And I'll leave you with this beautiful photograph of one of our important Australian species, Closteroceras mirabilis, whose name means beautiful, and I'm sure you can see why. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thank you very much.